Greetings, fellow OpenInsight software developers. My name is Robert Lee. Today I'd like to talk about using OpenInsight as a tool to publish software on the internet. My journey with OpenInsight began almost 20 years ago when I was asked to assist in the conversion of a school management system from Advanced Revelation DOS to OpenInsight for Windows. It was a pretty big project involving about 1,000 data entry forms and 1,000,000 lines of code, which isn't much if you say it quickly. Little did we know in those days that the next great conversion of software would be from Windows to the internet. Last year I was asked to look into the conversion of the same system from Windows to the internet, which I knew would be a bit more difficult. Let's have a quick look at the school management system to get a sense of the scale of the problem. Here's a login screen that anybody on the school network could log into. This system has around 30 different modules in the financial area. We have general ledger, debtors, fees, funds, etc. There's a bunch of student modules, and today we're going to have a very quick look at the main student database. So we'll bring a student up on the screen, and we're looking at a page of information here. Each of these icons across the top here represent another page of information that we store about students. So here we have the primary caregiver information, the secondary caregiver information, the global history of the student, health details, timetable details, what library books the student has or has had out, and so on. In fact, the full list of pages that are potentially available are found here, which as you see is quite extensive. So going back here, we're looking at the first page of information that we store about students, which is one form out of 1,000 forms. So the question is, what is the most efficient way to go about a large-scale conversion of an OpenInsight Windows application to the web? My first efforts at using OpenInsight for producing a web application date back about 15 years when the old iNet routines first came out. They required a lot of effort for a rather modest and quite unsatisfactory result. So I was delighted when OpenInsight 9 was released with O4W, OpenInsight for the web built in. It was much easier to produce the HTML. I also found it easier to control the other important building blocks of a professional website, namely the style sheets, templates, JavaScript. We even have access to jQuery. O4W was certainly a big step forward for OpenInsight. As good as O4W is, it still requires hundreds of lines of program code to create a complex form like the one you're looking at. That's because it requires hundreds more HTML tags to implement this on the web. There's simply no getting around the fact that this would be labor intensive. That much code simply takes hours and hours to produce and to test. The next problem I discovered was of creeping standards. By the time I'd done a few O4W forms, I looked back at my earlier work, and I found it necessary to rework it to bring it up to the same standard as my later work. And so it was as I travelled through the learning curve. This is a nasty cycle to get into, but unfortunately somewhat necessary. It also seems to mirror the moving target nature of the internet. What was best practice a few years ago is not best practice now, and best practice now will not necessarily be best practice in a few years' time. Popular browsers have had bugs, and over time they've been fixed. HTML5 is now the new black, and browsers are gradually phasing in its extended capabilities. So when I was presented with this problem of a large-scale conversion of an application to the web, I realized we would have to find a better way. I wondered whether it was possible to create a magic wand that would take an existing OpenInsight application and present it on the web. Last year I attended a Revelation Users Group conference in Auckland, New Zealand with Mike Ruane. I mentioned in passing to another OI software developer that I was working on this problem. He memorably described my noble ambition as the Holy Grail. In hindsight, I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that. I discovered that there are some serious difficulties in trying to take an OI application and present it on the web. In some respects, the web environment is distinctly incongruent with the Windows environment. But in other respects, I found there are distinct similarities. After all, we are really just trying to get the user to do the same sort of things. It's just that we want them to see these things in a browser window instead of a desktop window. That's all. The first obvious problem I encountered is that Windows explicitly positions controls on a screen, whereas HTML implicitly positions controls. I'll show you what I mean. If we're designing a form in Windows, we can drag it around. And what's changing here is the XY coordinates of those controls, and we can put them anywhere we like, whether it makes sense or not, or whether or not it looks beautiful or not. And that's how Windows works. Let's have a look at how a web page does something similar. Here's the login page for Facebook, and we'll have a look under the bonnet at this field here. And what we find is that it's created in HTML, and that Facebook use an input tag which they have called email, and they have a bunch of attributes there, but nowhere in there are XY coordinates. That control is positioned after the previous control, after the previous tag, which was a TD, and so HTML works. Quite different arrangement from the Windows arrangement. The second, but not so obvious problem that I encountered is that Windows is patient, whereas an internet request is impatient. What I mean by that is that Windows waits for the users to patiently click and type things. An OI program will wait patiently for the user to choose an item from a pop-up. Before it continues, whereas a request from the internet is processed in a fraction of a second and waits for nobody. In the internet environment, it is the browser, which might be on the other side of the world, that is patient and waits for the user to choose something. The browser then tells us what the user chose as a separate event, an event that doesn't even exist in Windows. This means that existing OpenInsight programs that rely on program flow being halted while the user chooses something will be structured in a way that is incompatible with how the internet works. On the positive side, OpenInsight Forms do define in detail what we would like to see emulated in some fashion on the internet. An OpenInsight form is a rich source of detailed information about what we want our users to see and experience. So what we can't do is take an existing OpenInsight Windows application, create a magic wand, and expect it to work on the internet. I think that is asking too much. However, what we can do is use the OpenInsight Form Designer and, bearing in mind that we are designing a form to be used on the web as well, design the form in such a way that it would be aesthetically pleasing both in Windows and on the web. What we can also do is write a single commuter module for a form that supports the form in both the Windows and the Internet environments. In other words, we can copy and paste our existing OI forms and tweak them for the Internet. We can copy and paste our existing OI code and tweak it for the Internet. In essence, we can use OpenInsight as a tool to create a new application. That new application would be capable of working harmoniously both in Windows and on the Internet. To do this does require something of a magic wand, which I have called O4WX, or O4W Extended. Join me in the next video where we continue our quest for this holy grail, and I shall demonstrate the magic wand in action.